And with that, Ben, the floor is yours.
Let me share my screen. And I think Juliet is going to also post the slides that I'm going to show. She can post them in the chat. And I think many of you got them via email to begin with. So let's just see how we're doing. Can everybody, let me get back to the beginning. Can everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up, someone, if it looks like it's working. Good. Okay. So these are the slides. I've given this presentation to this group every year. I think it's 8 years now. I haven't kept track, but it's a while. So this is becoming a regular thing. And the idea is every year to compare the various watch lists that many of us are familiar with. And year after year, the broad findings are the same. So if you've been at one of these before, there's not going to be dramatically different conclusions. But nonetheless, I kind of like to show everybody what's new for the year. I always include some new lists. And partly I just like to make these data available to folks because I know people do use them in various ways. And so I think of this partly as just an effort to, roll out the lists of lists so that people can have them. For lack of a better term, I'm calling these watch lists or human rights watch lists, although some of them are more about governance and some are more about development and some are more about physical violence. There's not a really great term to encompass all of those, but they often have something to do with some kind of human rights. And I've been a consumer of these lists for as long as I can remember, and a producer even of some of them. I've been involved in the Early Warning Project at the Holocaust Museum for a long time, and before that at the Political Instability Task Force. So I've always had an interest in these lists and trying to understand what's going on sort of behind them. I will say, though, that despite all the effort that goes into these lists every year, we do tend to be a little bit siloed. So those of us who produce these lists, we focus on our list and we spend a lot of time making sure it looks right to us, but we don't think a lot about how they relate to all the other lists that are out there. And so that's really what this presentation is about. And if you have spent time with these lists, either as part of this presentation or just on your own, I think it's pretty hard to avoid the conclusion when you look at them that they're tapping into some kind of underlying common set of factors, and that those underlying factors tell us something important or profound about the causes of the things that are on these lists: political instability, economic underdevelopment, human rights abuses, violence. And that maybe that might give us some clues about how we go about addressing these seemingly disparate problems, but problems that nonetheless seem to emerge in the same places year after year. So when you do take a look at these lists, there's always two questions that jump to mind. One, these lists are different. Lots of them measuring different kinds of things and using different kinds of methods. And so interesting to ask just how much overlap really is there. And then second, as you'll know, if you've seen this presentation before or even just spent some time with the lists, a lot of the countries at the top of these lists, and by top, I mean bottom, the worst part of the list, they're the same. They might not be in exactly the same order, but there's a lot of congruence between the different lists. And that's interesting because the lists are trying to measure sometimes completely different concepts, everything from protection of women's rights to genocide to environmental protections to government corruption. They use widely different measures of the inputs into the lists, even when they're measuring similar concepts. They use different methodologies. Some of them are pretty much qualitative. Some use kind of large N statistical observational data. Some rely on expert polling. And then some of them are really about trying to describe the world as it is today, and others are explicitly about forecasting things that are going to happen in the future. And yet, despite all those differences, you'll see there's a ton of overlap between the lists. And so I think that does make us ask, what is driving that underlying continuity? Is there a relatively small list of factors that all the lists have in common? And spoiler alert, yes, there is, and I'll talk about what some of those are at the end. So what are the lists for this year? So this is the list of lists. This year I've got 20. I think one year I had as many as 22, but I try not to get too many more than that just because we can't get them all on one slide. And I try to pick lists that I know are very widely used. I try to pick lists that are regularly updated, so generally not looking at anything that hasn't been updated for 2 or more years, or that doesn't promise to be updated continually. And I have a little bit of a bias towards the conflict and atrocity focused lists, just because that's the area where I work on, so they're overrepresented in this list of lists, and those lists are at the top usually. So the first 9 or 10 of these lists are really focused very closely on conflict. I'd urge you to kind of keep this page handy, because you'll see in a lot of the slides that come later, these abbreviations are what I use to refer to each list. And unless you're me, you won't know what many of these abbreviations stand for. And you can go and look at the last column, what does it measure, to see what exactly is that list about. How are they trying to measure it? There are 2 new lists on this year's list of lists. So the first one is views, which comes from our friends at Uppsala University and Prio. It's been around for a while, but this is the first year it's really had kind of a full global coverage. And so I included it for that reason. It's predicting the probability of conflict in the future. And in particular, you could choose, if you go to the Views website, you'll see there are different things that it forecasts. I decided, just because I thought it would be interesting, to look at their longest range forecast. So they're forecasting now out to January of 2028. That's the longest forecast window we have in any of the lists. And focusing here on the probability of a conflict that has at least 25 battle-related deaths. If you look at a map, kind of heat map of the views list, this is what it looks like, with countries in red having the highest probability of one of these conflicts out in January 28, and countries in blue having the lowest. And this is one of the most sophisticated conflict forecasting lists out there, so I'm glad to have it in the roster of lists. The second new list is a kind of out of left field one, but I thought might be interesting nonetheless. That's the World Happiness Report. This one has also been around for a while. The first time we're including it on this list. And it tries to measure using public opinion polls. So this is a public opinion poll delivered by Gallup to over 140 countries every year. You could see the exact question, this Cantrell ladder question that gauges happiness. And on this map, the darker purple colors indicate happier countries, and the lighter purple countries indicate less happy countries, and the gray countries are ones where you couldn't do any polling, and I suggest that's an indication that they probably aren't very happy if you can't even run a public opinion poll there. But of course, we don't know without the data. So those are the lists for this year. Happy, as always, to take suggestions. If I've left out your favorite list, you can email me, and I'll see if I can get it on the list of lists for next year. One way, and I always credit Jim for thinking about things this way, that you can kind of organize these lists is in this kind of two-dimensional list space. And, you know, on the horizontal axis here on the bottom, it's kind of the substantive focus of the list. What are they looking at? Is it governance? That's things like, you know, the rule of law index. Is it human rights in some way, political rights? You might think of Freedom House or VDEM as measuring those kind of aspects of democracy. Violence and conflict, so, you know, that might be the Fragile States Index or the Global Peace Index, all the way to atrocities, like the Atrocity Forecasting Project or the Museum's Early Warning Project. And then on the vertical axis is whether the list is really focused on just measuring what's going on right now or trying to do forecasting. And you could see as you go up higher on there, these are lists that are more explicitly focused on forecasting. And there's some that I've put in kind of the middle where they have some forecasting aims, but it's not explicitly a forecasting list. Notice up in the upper left is a quadrant that is usually empty. And I was really happy in the last 2 years that it wasn't empty, because VDEM came out with a model that they were promising to update every year that was anticipating regime change, so forecasting changes in a state's governance situation. But unfortunately, those lists haven't been updated in the last 2 years, and so I left them off. I hope they will come back, but for now, that quadrant is empty again. Okay, so let's have a look at these lists. This is a crazy busy slide. I don't expect you to even really be able to read the names of the country on it, although if you want, in the deck of slides that you have got, you can go to the end, and I have these in bigger font for you. But instead, I just want to kind of have you step back a little bit and think about what these lists are. There are 162 countries max on these lists. Some lists don't rate every single country. Here, I've just got the top 30 for each country. Being 1 is bad, so being at the top of these lists is bad. You want to be country 162, not country number 1. And what I've done in this chart is I've highlighted the country name in green if it overlaps with the 21st list, which is just the average rank of a country on all the other 20 lists. So the more green you have, the more you overlap with the average list. In other words, the more your list is kind of like the mean median list that there is. And you can see there is a lot of green there. So green represents overlap with the average list. That should say, by the way, the 2025 average list, not the 2024 average list. If the country's name is in bold, that indicates that it's got an ongoing mass killing, according to the Early Warning Project. And you'll see quite a bit of bold, especially at the top of those lists. And then finally, highlighted in orange are the Global Fragility Act priority countries. And those are listed down there. And I always try to call those out just so you can have a look and see how they do. So that's a way of looking at these lists. One thing just to note about the lists is it uses something that's sometimes called the track rank, which just means if 2 countries are tied at number 2, then the next country, instead of being number 3, just jumps to number 4. So you'd have country 1, rank 2, and then rank 4 after that. So some of these lists have ties, some of them do not. Here's another slide that shows us that average ranking list, but I put the list all the way out to the top 50 instead of just the top 30, so you could see a little bit more what countries are up there. And again, one thing that just jumps out is you see how much overlap there is with countries that have an ongoing mass atrocity, mass killing, as coded by the museum. 6 of the top 10, 11 of the top 20 highest ranked countries. And for the GFA priority countries, all but 2 are in the top 50. They tend to be near the bottom half of the top 50, you'll notice, but they're all in the top 50. So again, just indicates these lists are picking up on some of the stuff that that seems to matter. Here's another way to look at the average list. This has all the countries where I was able to calculate an average rank, so 162 different countries, with darker reds, meaning your rank is low numbers, but high risk, and lighter yellows, meaning your rank is high, meaning low risk. So you could see Europe and Canada, very light yellow, meaning low risk. At Central Africa and through the Middle East, a lot of red going on there. And that's the same pattern we see on these kind of heat maps every year. The next way that you can look at these lists, and I'm going to go through this very quickly just to kind of show you that it's there, let you have a look at it yourself, is to take any individual country that you're interested in and just see how it ranks across the 20 different lists. Which list is it high on? Which list is it low on? And for almost any country, you'll see there's some variation there where it's high on some lists and lower on others. So I always produce this set of graphs for the GFA countries, the countries of concern, just so you can see where each country ranks. Here, lower bars mean, again, you are higher risk on each of those lists, and higher bars, longer bars mean you were lower risks. Here's Haiti. Its average rank was 19th. That's the highest among the GFA countries. It's on 15 of 20 top 30 lists. So 2/3 of the lists had Haiti in their top 30, and you could see some of them have it as high as 4th or 5th, and then some, like the Global Terrorism Index or the Early Warning Project's atrocity forecasting list, have it ranked actually quite low. And so you can see there's some variation there, but most of the lists have it ranked very high. I'm not going to go through the other countries one by one, just show you that, again, they're there and that there's some interesting variation, but I want to leave time for discussion. Here's Togo, Guinea, Libya, Benin, Papua New Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. Ghana has always been the lowest rank or lowest risk of the GFA countries. Only one of these 20 lists ranks it in the top 30 on any of the lists, and that's the World Happiness Report. So it's number 23, meaning the 23rd least happy country according to that list. And in all the other lists, it tends to be in the bottom third of countries, thereabouts. So that's another way to look at the data that you can get from this. Of course, another thing you might be interested in is how much these lists have changed, rankings on these lists, how much they've changed between last year and this year. And again, here I'm just looking at the average across 13 lists that I had in common between the 2 years, and that I thought were focused on kind of roughly the same sorts of things. I excluded some of the more bespoke lists here. But this is a way to see how much change there is from year to year. And I think, again, you'll see, so the green means you had some improvement, red means you got worse, and yellow means you stayed about the same. Main thing you'll see when you look at this, just look at the color, is there's a lot of yellow, not a lot of movement. Among this top 30 list in these, on the average, only 5 countries moved by more than five or more places. So Nigeria, Libya, Bangladesh, they each declined by at least 5 places. You can see Bangladesh with the biggest decline at dropping 9 places. And a few places, Mozambique and Haiti, improved by at least 5. So Bangladesh, that's probably again reflecting the protests last summer and the collapse of the government, even though maybe we have some hope that the new government will be better than the last. It seems to have at least been picked up in last year's lists as a decline. So it gives you some sense, but still generally lots of stability between lists year on year. There aren't a ton of huge movers when you average all the lists together. We'll see in a moment when you look at individual lists, there's sometimes bigger movement, but the average stays very consistent, which is, I think, what you would expect. Here's another way to look at that same data, but now instead of just looking at the top 30 countries, I can show you all 162 countries and their ranks on the 2 years. So on the vertical axis there is the score for 2025 on the average list, and on the horizontal axis is your score for last year. And so what this means is if a country appears kind of above the sort of 45-degree line coming out of the origin of that axis, that means it saw some improvement. Its rank is lower, its rank is higher, but more risk but less risk in 2025 than it was if it's below the 45-degree line, in which case things got worse in that country and its rank went down closer to 1, meaning more risk in 2025. And so you could see there's a handful of countries there that moved far off the 45-degree line, but not that many. It's mostly pretty well clustered all the way along from 0 to 162 with not much movement between the 2 years. Cote d'Ivoire, Saudi Arabia, they improved, whereas North Korea, Bangladesh, they declined, but none really by more than 10 or 12 points. So lots of consistency. Again, just so you can see, I've colored the countries in red that have an ongoing early warning project, mass killing, and in orange again the GFA countries, just to show you where they fall. So that's another way of visualizing changes year on year. Now, if we want, we can kind of pick a particular list and look at changes year on year in that list. So I started here with the museum's early warning project list. Oh, I'll say, by the way, up on the top, you'll see this thing, the list correlation, which is 0.99, which is extraordinarily high. This is just the correlation coefficient, which ranges between -1 and +1, with +1 meaning that there's a perfectly linear relationship between the 2 lists. They're identical. And so here a 0.99 correlation basically means that 99% of the variance in the 2025 list is explained by the variance in the 2024 list. So they are very, very similar. Typically in the social sciences, we think of anything above 0.7 as being a strong correlation and above 0.8 as being extremely strong, really kind of indicating the lists are measuring virtually the same thing. So here we can look at the early warning projects change from 2024 to 2025. Same basic setup. If you're above the 45-degree line, that means your risk went down in 2025 versus 2024. And if you're below, it means things got worse. And you can see South Sudan there got way worse on the early warning projects list. And we spent a fair bit of time trying to figure out exactly why that happened. And I don't think we actually have a great answer. Sometimes on any given list, your rank might change less because of what changed in your numbers as opposed to what happened with some countries around you in the list. And I think that may be partly what happened in South Sudan. But still, even on this list where you could see there's much more spread, the correlation between the 2 years is 0.92, so very high correlation year on year. Of course, you can also compare different lists to each other. And so here I've selected 2 lists, the Fragile States Index from Fund for Peace and the Inform Index. Both of these lists kind of share a similar aim. They're trying to look at general instability, but they use a quite different set of methods and data. So interesting to see that those differences still result in very strongly correlated scores. And I noticed there again, it should say 2025 Inform rank. These lists are from the same year. I just forgot to update that year on the chart. But still quite a bit of clustering around the 45 degree line. You can see a few countries that deviate. So Sri Lanka down there on the bottom has a higher risk on the FSI list than it does on the Inform list, whereas, say, Papua New Guinea is higher on the Inform list and somewhat lower on the FSI list. You can see all those for yourself. So that's another way you can use these data. Here's another 2 lists. This is a comparison between the new list, the World Happiness Report, and the conflict forecasting project report. That's Hannes Mueller's project out of the Institute for Economic Analysis in Barcelona. Quite interesting conflict forecasting project that uses text data from news sources to forecast what countries are most likely to have high levels of violence. So here it's looking at the number of anticipated fatalities in the next 12 months. And you can see here the correlation is not that strong. 0.38 correlation. And so suggesting that your predicted risk of fatalities in conflict is not that strongly correlated with how happy your people are when we poll them. If, however, we swap out the conflict forecasting list for the Human Development Index from the World Bank, which is, many of you will know, is a kind of, combined index of life expectancy, education, income, a kind of composite of these things. Here, the correlation between that and the World Happiness Report is much higher at 0.82, which gives you a sense that in terms of what guides people's happiness, it has more to do with those day-to-day factors, your income, your health, level of education, than maybe the conflict grabbing, the headline grabbing conflict stuff does. And one reason I could imagine that might be true is that in a big country, there might be a conflict in one part of the country, but maybe people in most parts of the country are not directly affected by it. Another possibility is that people get used to living in conflict, but less used to living with poverty and poor health and all of those sorts of things. So that's another way to compare things. Here's another set of ways to compare the lists. And so what I've done here, these are those correlation coefficients again. And I'm just allowing you now to compare each list with every other list. So every pair of lists has a cell on this slide. And I've color-coded them again with green, meaning there's the strongest correlation between the lists, and red meaning the correlation between those 2 lists is relatively low. And you can look in the cell to see the exact level of correlation. Of course, that diagonal there, that's dark green, is always 1, because that's just comparing the list to itself. So there's always perfect correlation there. And here I'm comparing the full list, so all 162 countries on each list with each other. You could see the correlations generally are quite high. The average correlation of all of these, if you just take each cell and take the average, it's 0.66. So the lists are pretty heavily correlated with each other. Fair bit of green on this chart. The strongest correlation that I found highlighted there with the red square is between the World Inequality Database, which measures income inequality, and the Human Development Index, which doesn't directly measure income inequality, but has in it a number of things that, like infant mortality and educational achievement, that are correlated with income inequality. We can then zoom in to the top 30, and we see a quite different pattern. So you'll notice a lot more yellows and reds here. And now the average correlation coefficient has dropped from, what was it, 0.66, when we just looked when we looked at the whole rank of lists, 162 countries, to when we just look at the correlation between the countries in the top 30. And so much less correlation within how you're ranked within the top 30. There still are some quite strong correlations here. The Inform and Fragile States Index is correlated at 0.85. But some of the correlations are actually negative, meaning within the top 30, if you're higher on one list, you're likely to be lower on the other list, and those are the ones that are highlighted in dark red. There's one final way to look at the way these top 30 lists overlap, which is just to ask, let's put aside exactly how you rank within the top 30 and just ask how much of the numbers of the countries are in common across any two lists. And that's what this chart will allow you to do. And you can see there's a much higher amount of overlap here, suggesting lots of commonality in the top 30 list, but not necessarily, as the last slide showed us, in the ordering of that top 30. The average list shares 18.5 countries with any other list, so that's more than half. And the highest, ACLED cast, which is a conflict forecasting list, and the conflict forecasting project, which I mentioned earlier, they share 27 out of the top 30 countries in common. So pretty high amount of overlap there, despite the fact that they use very different methods. And the ACLED list is forecasting the number of conflict events, and conflict forecasting project is forecasting the level, the severity of fatalities, how many fatalities you would expect. So again, lesson of those last 3 slides is much more agreement that some countries are high risk and some countries are low risk than there is which countries are highest risk among the high risk countries. That is something that there's much less agreement on. And we don't know whether that's because we're really uncertain about what drives differences in risk among smaller groups of countries, especially at the top of the list, or whether this is the kind of special sauce of each list. It's calling out the thing that list is specifically designed to measure. Okay, so we know there's a fair bit of agreement among the lists, and I'm wrapping up now, Jim, just so you know. But the question is, what's driving all of this? And so to explore this, I picked 8 variables from the existing literature on mass atrocities and human rights and conflict that seemed like they might be candidates as drivers for rank on these lists. And it's not surprising some of these are candidates, because some of the lists, a few of them, actually use these variables to construct the list. So most lists don't use all of these, but some lists, many lists, use at least some of these. And the variables I chose are the total population of a country, the democracy level measured by VDEM, country's GDP, its infant mortality rate, how many conflict deaths it had suffered. This is the next one's a new variable for this year, the number of new internally displaced people in 2024. So for predicting your risk in 25. The ethnic fractionalization index, which is a measure of how ethnically diverse your country is, and VDEM's social group power equality score, which measures how unequally power is distributed among social or racial ethnic groups within society. And to try to understand the kind of size of these effects on your ranking on the list, what I did was I rescaled all of the variables to have a mean score of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And then I normalized all of the list scores so that the average rank is so that the list ranges from 0 to 1 instead of from 1 to 162. And what that means makes this chart much easier to interpret. Instead of having each variable measured in its own units and with its own distribution, now you can just look at each variable and you know it's measured as essentially how many standard deviations above the mean that country is for that variable. And we know that the mean of that variable is 0. So for example, what that would mean is if Rwanda's normalized score for GDP is -1, that means that Rwanda's GDP is 1 standard deviation below the mean of other countries' GDPs. And since I've rescaled the ranks here to go from 0 to 1 instead of 1 to 162, what the number you're looking at on the screen means is the percent change in your risk score if we move that variable by 1 standard deviation. And so there's a -0.1 coefficient there on that democracy variable. And that means if we move a country 1 standard deviation on its democracy score, it declines by about 10% on that list of ranks. So since there's 162 countries, a 10% change is about 16 places. And you can see here, therefore, kind of how much each of these factors matters. And the key takeaway is the big things that matter are these kind of slow-moving structural variables: population, democracy, GDP, infant mortality, and then somewhat less some conflict indicators. And not at all, because the error bar overlaps with 0, are measures of ethnic diversity or discrimination. We don't see any effect on your rank for those variables. So I think that tells us something important. And I'll just wrap up here with an observation I like to make about these kinds of lists, which is, what do we learn from this? Is that our lists are really focused on places that are kind of at structural risk. They're fragile, waiting for some trigger to push them into crisis. And that's quite similar to the way we think about earthquake risk. We know where on the earth earthquakes are likely to happen, right? They don't tend to happen in Nova Scotia, you can see from this map, and they do tend to happen in Chile. But we don't know when exactly it's going to happen in Chile. We're much worse at that, even though we know it's more likely to happen there than it is in Nova Scotia. Same thing if your doctor tells you you have risk factors for heart disease. We know you're more likely than someone who doesn't have those risk factors to have a heart attack, but we don't know when exactly you'll have a heart attack. Less good at that. And that's the same, I think, in terms of these models. They pull out slow-moving risk factors that make you at risk for a problem, but they don't tell us when you'll have that problem. Okay, I will end there and turn it over to Holly, I think. Jim, is Holly next?
Yes. Holly,
Okay.
you're up.
I'll stop sharing.
I will. I have slides. I can put them in the chat. They are not particularly great slides by any means. They're just to keep me to time. So I'll throw those in the chat now, and then I'll just start by saying thank you so much for asking me to comment. I think this is a really fascinating endeavor, and I'll add this is my first time listening to this annual list comparison, so I hope that some of the things I have to say are new and that they're not things that other commentators have said in the past. So I was asked to keep it to 15 minutes. I'm going to try to do 12. We'll see. But I was thinking, I know we have someone else after me. There's a lot of folks I see on the list who know this topic really well, and I'm sure have really insightful things to say. So what I'll do is I wanted to pick up with Ben's central question of what other factors might explain this broad concordance across these lists. And I'll notice someone new to seeing this comparison, I was quite surprised by how similar they are. As Ben's pointing out, some of these are really high correlations that that would never just be random chance. So that was really interesting to see. So I'll start there. Then I'll give a couple of other random reflections, which is basically me just throwing some other reflections out there. And then I'll say a couple of thoughts on other ways forward. So how to move beyond, if a lot of these lists are telling us similar things, what are the next steps to move beyond this and to better enhance forecasting with an eye towards atrocity prevention, since I know that's what brings this group together. To start then, as Ben noted, and I loved the dimensions of list space, that some of these are measuring current conditions of human rights or governance, and others are really trying to forecast into the future, looking at conflicts or atrocities. And we're seeing a lot of similarities across these lists. And one of the things I thought of as I looked at the different countries is, as you all probably saw as well, and as I know as Ben notes, most of these have ongoing conflicts. And if you look at the top 30 countries from the list, as I looked at them, I think I counted 27. I might be off on my knowledge of current ongoing conflicts, but at least 27 have current ongoing conflicts. And I'd be really curious for a future list assessment, or perhaps this has been done in the past, to see if you remove countries with ongoing conflicts, what does this do to the lists? Because I'm wondering if part of this is they're tapping into that countries with ongoing conflicts are going to have worse systems of governance and worse human rights respect. And they're also, we know that conflict is one of the strongest predictors of future atrocities, and this is often going to be included in these models as well. So I'm wondering if just the presence of conflict, I understand that the level of conflict deaths wasn't particularly important, but I wonder if just sheer presence of conflict or ongoing levels of violence within a country is explaining a lot of what's going on. I also found myself wondering, it seems that if we have these two dimensions of list space and we have current data on governance and human rights abuses, I've seen a lot more research on indicators of governance as precursors or predictors of atrocities, and a lot less on indicators of human rights abuses and whether and how those are predicting atrocities. And I see David Synchronelli on the call, so I'm sure he has much more to say about this than I do. But it made me think that there might be space for additional research looking at other types of human rights violations and whether these might predict atrocities if we're thinking about this and trying to extend it into a more process-based model. I know of some looking at more political human rights abuses and sort of torture and personal integrity rights, but I could see a case after looking at all of this. It made me think there's a strong case for looking at a whole host of human rights within a society and seeing how those, whether and how those might affect different models that are actually trying to be predictive. The other thing it made me think, however, is I'm wondering if we're all using such similar data and if we're running into data legs. And that was something I don't have the answers. I didn't dig into all of the data, but I thought, as Ben knows, I see him nodding, when we're forecasting, we're often using old data. And I'm wondering if a lot of us are looking at similar years, even though some of these years are trying to look at, or some of these lists are looking at right now, and others are trying to forecast ahead. We're still only able to use old data. And I think that's a large issue with forecasting is we're still using data that are dated, and a lot of us are using similar data, like VDEM, for instance, and these data are always a couple of years behind in some ways. So part of me was also thinking, I wonder if that's also another factor that's shaping some of these similarities, is that we're using data actually from similar time periods, even though the lists have different aims, whether they're trying to measure now or look into the future. And a lot of these data are really state-centric data, given that, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And that made me think a bit more about how we can really start to measure processes of escalation and de-escalation. And I really appreciated that Ben noted triggers, and wanted to, I see Ernesto Verdejas on the call, and he has a great new paper on triggers as well, and really trying to look into, we know triggers are incredibly hard to measure because they're often dependent on context, but really trying to think more critically about how we could be thinking about triggers. And I think in light of Ben's last comment that we're really good at measuring these structural factors that increase risk, that a lot more effort should be placed on measuring these processes of escalation and de-escalation in addition to triggers. A couple of other thoughts. I'm trying to go quickly. I know we have another presentation. I know I'm really curious what other folks have to say, but this is my sort of just my random thoughts on the lists. I took a look at the list and I was trying to think what's missing and what might be driving what's missing. And I was surprised Israel's so low on so many of the lists, and the CF list had Israel quite high. And I think that speaks to the lack of disaggregated data within states, which I'm going to say a lot more about, but we don't have great data on Palestine. We have data on Israel. And I think that is a huge issue when we're thinking about forecasting. And that's a main reason we're not seeing Israel high on these lists, even though if you were to think about how accurate are these lists right now, you would think Israel would be in, in the top 5. Ukraine is also quite low on these lists, and it isn't in the top 30 across the lists. And I think that speaks to, our lists are really good at looking within countries, and they're not really geared towards looking at international conflicts. And we know that international conflicts declined over a number of decades, and we saw a rise of internal conflicts. And now we're at a space where we might need to be thinking about how do we get better at thinking about international conflicts once again, and how do we reflect that in these lists? Because you could also think of recent issues right now with Cambodia and their border in Thailand, and they're not really there either, right? But we wouldn't be ready to really be thinking about border conflicts in quite the same way. And a lot of the measures, I think, going into these lists aren't thinking about border conflicts or something like Russia and Ukraine. So I think as we think about what is missing from these lists and what does that mean for how we think about forecasting atrocity, thinking more creatively about what is impacting these international dynamics will be really critical. And then, of course, missing data, which Ben noted, but I would think North Korea would be quite high on a lot of these, and you're not seeing it. And I'm assuming it's because we don't have great data on North Korea. And there's others too, right? I know there's a lot of small island nations that if you'll talk with folks, they might tell you risk seems high. But the small island nation data is quite terrible across countries. And even the lists that are using less quantitative measures, I think, are still relying often on existing data. And there are a number of countries we just don't have great data on. So I think thinking about that as well. A couple of other really random thoughts that I'm just going to throw out in no particular order. I was struck also by some of these endeavors, especially the Early Warning Project and the Atrocity Forecasting Project, are really thinking about violence targeting groups. And others lists are not thinking about violence targeting groups. And when we think about atrocity prevention, I think we often think about group-based targeting as central to how we think about atrocity prevention. And I have no other thoughts on that other than I found that was interesting and curious if there's better group specific data or how we make sense of these similarities, given that some of these lists are really focused on groups and others are broadly focused on patterns within society. With that, I was thinking the perceived mass atrocities database might be useful, but I don't think it's updated. So perhaps that's not why it wasn't included. But that's one of the few that I know is trying to think critically about violence against like LGBT plus communities and women. And I could see the case for thinking about these as precursors or human rights abuses as well. But I think they're at the Corbell School, and I don't believe they're as updated as some of these others. But it might be worth thinking about this list, or are there other lists that are trying to take a gender sensitive approach? The other thing I thought as I looked at all of these lists is I really appreciated the inclusion of a list on climate. And as Ben knows, and as I think most of the folks on this call know, if you talk with folks on the ground, people are often convinced that environmental triggers and factors matter, but they just don't matter in the large scale models in the same way. And that's another problem or issue that I think we should be contending with as we're thinking about how to further refine these lists, is what is the role of the environment. And I think this is only going to grow in concern over the coming decades as we see more and more issues with climate change and climate disasters. And I know we struggle to measure it, but I think this is something we should be thinking about, and really appreciate seeing that one list on there, but know that that's more about attainment of environmental performance goals and not so much perceptions of scarcity within people's communities, for instance. Another thing I think would be interesting to do, make sure I'm staying on time, would just be thinking more about the changes in the list and sort of like how countries are fluctuating on the list. So I deeply appreciated Ben's analysis of changes from year to year. And I understand that a lot of countries stayed the same, but I could see if we believe these lists are accurate, the case for case studies on a number of these countries that did really jump up or down in risk across these lists, and thinking about what actually is happening in these countries to adjust to make these changes. And I know Ben mentioned sometimes it's about the other countries and not the country itself, but I would still be really curious for more on that. And I'm not going to say so much about this, but I was really interested in thinking about the inconsistency in rankings or the consistency in rankings. And as you all know, standard deviation is kind of a crude measure, but if you look at the standard deviation in like list placement, some of them vary quite a bit. And I think they're speaking to different ways of measuring risk, like Ukraine had the highest variation in terms of where it was on the lists. And I think that could be old data, it could be something else. And we also see Venezuela in a lot of variation of where it is on the lists. And we know there's widespread repression in Venezuela, but that might not be tapped into in measures of conflict, for instance, as some might not consider it an ongoing conflict. So I think thinking about variation in where countries are, or if you look at particular countries where you don't expect them to be. Afghanistan was 28th on the CF list, which I thought, even though they were really good on some other forecasts, that one was quite low, for instance. Or Lebanon being third on the happiness index was a really interesting one, given that it's not showing up in other places in quite that way. So thinking a little bit more about that. Another worthwhile endeavor, I think, would be to think through which countries are really driving the lists. And this is something I'm hoping to do soon and hope others look at as well, is there's a lot of new techniques in statistical modeling with regression to kind of think about which countries and which cases are actually driving the models. And we're getting this like big composite score, but at the end of the day, certain countries are driving the models more than others, and thinking a little bit more critically about which countries are driving the models, and are these countries we should be studying more or countries we should be excluding as outliers given different issues with the countries. So that's something I think, given a lot of new advances of decomposing regressions that have come out in a couple of different methods pieces over the last year or two, could be a really interesting thing to think about for the future. The other thing I'll say, because I think I'm almost up to the 12 minutes I promised I would take, is I again appreciate that Ben mentioned thinking about triggers and noting that we're really thinking about these broader structural factors at the country level, and we're not doing the best job thinking about the timing of violence. And this is something that I know a lot of you are familiar with, but if you're not familiar with, I think is another way to move forward, with the caveat that we have, less than ideal data to do it. But I think if we can get better data, the subnational analysis is really where I think a lot of this could be moving. And political science has been fantastic over the last decade in seeing a huge growth of research looking at conflicts, not at a country level, but really at a subnational level. And I have a much older photo on the screen. I think this is an image back from 2014 that just sort of shows, if you think about it at the country level, sometimes the violence is impacting the entire country, but oftentimes it's not. And oftentimes it's in certain parts of a country. And we know that there's great research coming out of political science and criminology on the factors that are impacting this. So, and I see Scott Strauss on the call. He wrote a great piece for a handbook I edited for Oxford a couple of years ago on mesolevel dynamics of violence, and trying to call for more attention to, what do we think about these mesolevel or subnational spaces. And there's a great annual review that came out a few years ago of the Annual Review of Political Science, really kind of trying to highlight that within these subnational spaces, you can also measure resource scarcity or the presence of resources, unemployed young men, ethnopolitical exclusion, the presence of certain groups, and that this can also help us identify the onset of atrocity at subnational levels, which I think is particularly promising. With that, I'll add criminology has been doing this for I don't know how many decades and decades in more Western contexts, looking at subnational levels of crime. And a lot of these factors, I think, could be transferable to other settings. So they're looking at things like community trust and cohesion. So do people feel collective efficacy in their neighborhoods? How much mobility is there in a neighborhood? Is there legal cynicism? Do people trust their police? We know that there are hotspots of crimes for a variety of reasons. And I think a lot of this wealth of research could really be useful as we're thinking about atrocity forecasting in subnational spaces. Of course, I'm not naive, and I understand that data are not great at the country level, so it can be naive to think they're great at a subnational level. But I do think that there are great census data at a subnational level, and a lot of what criminologists use are actually census data to try to generate proxies of community cohesion and residential mobility and who lives where, for instance. So I could see the case for trying to think about moving forward to subnational analysis as well, whether it's levels of violence or triggers or just the presence of atrocities in subnational spaces. And I bring all of that up, and in addition to what Ben noted, that if we're really good at these broad structural factors, how do we advance our forecasts? And if year after year you're finding that a lot of these lists are saying the same thing, I don't want to say it feels stalled, but then what do we do then to even further enhance these endeavors that a lot of us care so much about? So with that, I know I threw a lot of things at you in terms of Ben's central question. I think considering just the presence of conflict and looking at taking these countries out, and then what does this do for the correlations among lists? I'd be so curious, as well as thinking about if we're all using the same data, they're actually all from about the same time, even if we don't necessarily like to admit it, through a whole host of reflections about ways forward. And I look forward to hearing the third presenter and then to hearing what everyone else has to say. And also just thank you, Ben, for doing all of this work. I imagine it took quite a bit of time to compile all these lists and run these analyses. And I think it's just a large service for the field, as so many folks care deeply and spend so much time and effort and resources into creating these lists. So thank you for taking the time to do it.
Thank you, Holly. We'll pass over to Chris now.
Is this coming through on your side? Great. Is it on full screen, or is it okay, here we go. Great. So what I'm going to do is great to follow these fantastic presentations. Thanks, Ben. Good to be with you yet again over the years, Holly. Yeah, great to see your work. What we do at Peloria is we look at more frequently changing phenomena, right? So I think Ben and Holly both really identify the crux of the problem, which is, fortunately for those societies, conflicts aren't starting all the time, right? But when conflicts start, some of them, sadly, persist. And those that do persist have change in the levels of those conflicts. And there are other phenomena, either material to the conflicts or as a consequence of the conflicts, usually both, that also change frequently. And so what we do is we develop models that predict change in the levels of a phenomena that is changing more frequently, and machine learning models, when you have historical depth in the data and velocity, so like frequency of change in that data, then you're in a much stronger position to be able to forecast something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some examples, and then I'll zoom in on one that we recently delivered for the World Bank, that forecast change in displacement. So I'll start by just sharing a short 2-minute video that sort of summarizes
every year
that work.
Millions flee their homes due to conflict, climate change, or other crises. When refugees arrive in large numbers, host communities struggle as basic public services, health, education, and water are overstretched. Resources often arrive too late or not where they are needed most. But what if we told you AI can predict refugee movements before they happen and help us prepare better responses? The World Bank has developed an AI-powered model to support the Displacement Crisis Response Mechanism, or DCRM, the world's first displacement risk financing mechanism. The AI model uses machine learning to predict refugee arrivals 4 to 6 months in advance. It analyzes over 90 variables like conflict, economic shifts, climate data, and even news and social media language to anticipate movement. This prediction data enables governments to build water points, expand health facilities, and construct classrooms before refugees arrive. The model has been tested in Uganda, UNHCR's daily refugee arrivals data from 2014 to 2023. Data scientists collected the data for refugees coming from South Sudan and the DRC, producing a model with high predictive accuracy. When refugee inflows increased pressure on Ugandan services, the DCRM was triggered and funds were disbursed to build up water points, health facilities, and schools. Better access to public services reduces tensions between refugee and host communities and strengthens resilience. The AI model also identifies which factors drive change in refugee flows. This evidence helps the World Bank better target operations and prevent displacement. In the future, the model could also be adapted to predict and explain other important development issues, such as poverty levels or macro fiscal pressures. Learn how AI is helping predict refugee.
I'll spare you all the subsequent, branding and promotion that, as academics, that probably all sounded sort of pretty superficial in any event. But you have to get the word out somehow, and we're grateful to our communications colleagues in the bank for putting these sort of one pages and videos and helping us protect ourselves from ourselves when we write blogs trying to explain what we're doing to people. But in effect, what we do at Peloria is we accept the difficulty of predicting change in social phenomena. And of course, we all know that we behave not only according to change in reality, so the built world, the social world, the natural world, and all the dimensions of it, but also our perception of that reality. And so we try to account for change in those dimensions of reality, but we also lever, as the video said, online language from social media, online news about all these things, right? And that helps us not only better predict, for example, so if we're looking at the number of daily explosions in the Donbass region of Ukraine, but also we then engage in analysis of the models, so integrated gradient ablation analysis, to identify, which dimensions of the data that we're ingesting into our models are most associated with change. And that then, of course, helps our colleagues target what they do. So one example is, the change in population, as you just saw. But as our colleague, Hollie just mentioned in her presentation, these are data scarcity issues often, right? So the bank might want to know what do we want to finance and where are the most vulnerable people? Well, the first problem is they don't even know where the people are, right? Like the last census might be, 10 years ago. And so we might collect all the data representing all these independent variables that you see listed here, but you've got a real problem when it comes to, well, if you want to predict population change, what data are you going to use? So we develop and then test the efficacy and representativeness of proxies for some of these things. So here is the Horn of Africa, obviously one of the most data scarce places in the world. And we developed an object classification model that in effect counts the number of built structures from satellite imagery, and then and collected that imagery for every month for, I think it was about 8 years. So the alternative would be 3 data points, right? And very rarely it would be 3 data points. It might be 1 or 2, let's be honest, in terms of budgets for household surveys for projects. And we get the level of historical depth and velocity we need to then predict change in population, then explain, or not explain, but identify which factors are most associated. We're always careful with any language around causation. And then that helps the bank, for example, in this sort of $330 million project across the region, better target what it does, at what scale, in what locations, and over what timeline, right? Here's another. And we're looking, and I don't recall now, either Ben or Holly mentioned, these challenges of small island states, right? And so here's one, the Solomon Islands, right? You might go to the government of the Solomon Islands and say, write an email, oh, could you send us the crime data? We want to predict crime, right? They probably never come back to you, but if they did, they would give you the the annual crime data, and it's good luck trying to predict change in that. So instead, we trained an agentic model, so LLMs that talk to one another, that read. There's 3 newspapers in the Solomon Islands. They can go and read the newspaper, identify how many articles in those newspapers going back, I think, about 10 years, talk about crime, right? So it's an imperfect measurement of crime. So is, of course, police, like episodes of crime reported to the police. But at least it gives us something, which is better than nothing. And then we can forecast that. You see the predictive performance on the side. And unlike the previous screen where I sort of grouped together all the different factors, just to give you a little bit of a visual, and this doesn't even capture all of it, of what a pie chart might look like, capturing all the range of phenomena going in. So you'll see whether it's everything from change in the level of salinity and temperature of the sea around the Solomon Islands through deforestation, demographic change through proxies of built structures in the peri-urban areas. And then you can start to explore, does crime increase dramatically in the lead up to significant social unrest events, and other issues that the Solomon Islands might be experiencing. Now to come back to that displacement risk financing mechanism, as you heard in the video and our colleagues in the bank love to note, it's the world's first displacement risk financing mechanism. And that's because our disaster risk finance colleagues, after reading a paper that we published some years back on predicting violence, came and said, well, if you could predict with this level of accuracy, then we could develop risk financing approaches to in the same way that we do for natural disaster risk, right? So that's what we've done here. The government of Uganda and the bank has put $10 million set aside from a project, and it will disperse when these thresholds are breached or are predicted to be breached, right? In terms of our metrics in the districts that host refugees. So we'll be measuring this in each of those districts that host refugees in Uganda. There's a 12 or 13, depending on if you accept like recent changes to some of them, right? But then we also identify which factors ingested into the model are most associated with change. So for our colleagues in the DRC, that can help them better target. So there's a $250 million project called the Stabilization and Recovery in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo project. And they can then better target the resources of that project to affect or attempt to affect factors that are most some of these factors that are most associated with change, right? A lot of them, and we'll go and highlight, okay, this is something you might be able to do something about, when it comes to like global fuel prices or something like that. It's like, well, okay, can't do much about that. But there are always a number, and to go to your point about the role of climate, right? A big part of it is once we render these models live, then it gets even more exciting because you can start to explore what we call the sequential relationship between phenomena. Again, I'm always careful about that word causation because there's always lurking variables, right? Like we can't go to neighboring country governments of DRC and say, oh, could you just pass the data representing the volume of arms that you're sending across the border into country X or Y? When qualitative and other forms of research strongly suggest these material phenomena are there, we can't get data to measure them. We can get language about those things, but again, here we can at least say we can then use different lags, to test, okay, how when the climate changes, because we get crop type, crop yield, crop failure down to about 5 square meters resolution, how's the climate affecting that, then affecting food prices, and how does that then relate to how people talk about these issues, and do they blame these like science-based drivers of change in in market pressures on food staples, or do they point the fingers at ethnic groups or political parties or political actors, specifically, right? And you can start to actually see that, and then the different phenomena we're able to capture from imagery. Now you see down on the bottom right hand, at the bottom there, it also enables the utility for other products, right? Like carbon credits. If you're able to see levels of deforestation, and you see that a district is able to keep levels of deforestation well down below what would proportionately be expected given the observed demographic expansion as a consequence of displacement into that district. So there's a number of utilities, to predict and understand better the societies in which we live, but then to design overall what you do in a country, design individual projects in terms of what, where, at what scale, when, even who we collaborate with, that can inform within projects sort of some flexibility, right? Like projects are often, we determine what we're going to do at the start of a project. It's a 5-year project, and especially in like fragile and conflict affected environments, situations and levels of need in different places change. So if we're able to better quantify that change over time, we're able to better build into projects the flexibility to adapt. And of course, it enables us to better monitor and evaluate what we've done well, what we've done wrong, and support governments, most importantly, so that more evidence-based policy and resource allocation can flow through government budgets, and that can be sustainable over the long term. And I guess for us, well, I'm not really an academic anymore, but a pseudo-academic wanting to be like many of you academics out there that just presented. It enables us to better explore some of these sequential relationships, to identify potential other theories, and then explore what data might measure different phenomena, and take that work forward so we can advance the evidence base upon which we act. So I'll leave it there. I might have gone over time. I know I wanted to try and keep to 10 minutes, but hopefully that was sufficiently whistle stop, but still gave a bit of an idea of at least a few of the models that we've been developing for governments, development banks, and now we're engaging more with the financial services and insurance sector. So soon to come, some other risk financing approaches to things like education and other phenomena, including for advanced economies, right? Where I think like our field has kind of been under-focused in some of our advanced economies. Often, it's a symptom of, okay, where does the funding come from and what's it for? And often it's for, governments to do things elsewhere. And that can sometimes drive a bit of a path-dependent bias in terms of not just what we do, but also where. Thanks, Jim, for the opportunity to speak to you and all the colleagues on the call.